So that was an excellent one last. I think this is going to be focusing on a little bit more narrow use case. I mean, there's a lot of common themes that we've been seeing throughout the day, and so we want to give a little bit more of an example. So one is, here's a traditional form. Nothing, terribly exciting about this. Still has relevance today. Will continue to have relevance in the future. But how can we start thinking about how we capture data in a slightly different way and poise it a little bit more to the future? Mobile has been around for quite some time. We're seeing more adoption of that. And it gets a little bit better on mobile. It gets more accessible. We've got a lot of devices, be a little bit more device agnostic in terms of how we do this data capture. But we can still do this a little bit better way. And one is voice. And so with Siri and Google Assistant, we're already starting to use voice capture to text for data input. But what's interesting is a lot of folks are doing this without the app developer themselves designing or knowing for this. So, what if we were to design voice first? What if we recognize that people want to interact with that way? And let's start designing it that way and give them the option opposed to just doing this. Right? So there's a couple different approaches on how we can do this. But we want to do more than just speech to text. We need to give context to this. And this is really where it adds value to it, where we want to just interpret that text and assist us, not necessarily automate everything, but assist us in how we fill out the form. So one of the ways we're doing this is through cognitive services, right? There's been a lot of discussion today and yesterday about this. We can do things like sentiment analysis and keyword phrasing analysis to assist us in fill out the form. We may be able to fill out the form completely by voice, but sometimes we want to do it through the interface. But we all know the benefits of BI, but really one of it is to, when we did a survey, or Harvard Review did a survey, they want to assist this. We don't want to automate everything. We want this technology to assist us. But conversely, as they said, that it's challenging. This stuff is hard to be able to do. But when we look at the data on some of these different things, is that it's not really that hard. It's just a lack of understanding and skill set within the business. So I'm here to tell you that it's really not that hard, right? You're seeing a lot of these examples a day, and it's not that it's this easy that a toddler could do it, but it's almost that easy, right? If we look at what's hard, getting requirements from the business, that's kind of hard, right? This isn't really that much better. So we look at the reality today. I kind of think, we are here. We're starting to experiment. We're starting to toy around these things. You're seeing some great examples of today and yesterday through that. We've got a long way to go to really make this right. But the point is kind of start experimenting with some of these things today. So some good examples of this is find ways to augment existing systems, right? Take something that's already out there and add to it, enhance it, augment it to that a bit. Find passion that, that are people within your organization that want to do this. Because it's really not that hard. And so when we look at where we can start, cognitive services is one of the easiest things out there to do. Sentiment analysis, keyword phrasing, those kind of things are easy. When we get into machine learning and deep analytics, that's hard. But there's a lot of services to choose from. We've seen a lot of examples today. And I would say you could start experimenting with some of these APIs. It's not as hard as you think in terms of some of the kind of lower hanging AI fruit, if you will. And one of our approaches is to use things like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft services, where we're taking our smart object technology, and like we've done with line of business systems, and assisting and adding some of these AI services to the platform so we can interact with it just like we would with any other line of business system. And that's really a differentiator for us, is that while we've seen some JSON examples, and I've seen lots of code here, we want to make this accessible with no code. Because if we're going to make AI accessible to the business, we need to do this in a more or less technical fashion. And so be able to add this AI data, just like any other business or line of business system, is really the key for adoption on a lot of these types of technologies. Can you go ahead and advance? Great. So how do we do this? So once we have those particular smart objects, the key is to reuse it, right? I don't want to be able to add JSON or add code every single time in my process. I want to build it once and reuse this across my forms, across my workflow. And so if that changes, we can modify it. So what about chatbots? We've seen a lot of that discussion here, and I'm going to be a little brave, and I'm glad the gentleman before me actually did a voice demo. We'll see if ours has similar success. But we can take that assistive approach and really build a chatbot out of this. But sometimes a chatbot can become fully automated, where we delegate all the input to a chat. But sometimes maybe we just want to start the conversation in chat and let that just allow us to fill out the form data. because sometimes those form densities is really deep, and we need voice to just assist us. And so how do we do this? Again, a lot of the commodity type AI frameworks out there, we use the Microsoft Bot framework, kind of give us an infinite amount of channels in which to be able to play with, whether it be Slack or the like. So I'm going to switch to my mobile here. And besides, I'm not demoing my cute daughter, even though she would love to be here at the moment. We're going to go ahead and start with a chat bot. So I'm going to say, talk to Mr. Bob.
Hello, I am K2 Bob. What can I help you with today?
I would like to take some leave.
What type of leave would this be? Paid time off, unpaid time off, or family responsibility leave?
PTO.
When would you like to start your paid time off?
Next Monday.
Okay, your paid time off will commence on the 23rd of April 2018. When do you intend to return to work?
Next Friday.
Great. I submitted a leave request for paid time off for you from the 23rd of April 2018 until the 27th of April 2018.
All right, so we've kind of done a very simple form, right? Leave request, handful of form inputs, very easy to kind of build the chatbot, start that process, submit the data, and off we go. But there's some other interesting things that we could do just to kind of interact with the process. I'm going to show some of that quickly here. So we can say something like, get my tasks.
You have one leave request task.
Open my last task.
Leave request for Brandon Brown needs approval. Available actions. Approve, reject, try again.
Make this Anthony's problem.
Great. I redirected this task to Anthony.
All right, so we can use these chatbots to not only kind of interact with these tasks, but obviously delegate work and perhaps get all the work. So we can also just final this up here and say,
not a whole lot. What's going on with you?
thank you.
It's my pleasure to help.
All right, so what do we kind of learn here? One is, and I liked the other gentleman's presentation where, we need to be friendly with our chatbots, right? We're going to feed the machine learning machines around this, so we want to say please and thank you and build in some mannerisms and some pleasantries into this. So that's what was helpful. One is chatbots are great, but they're not great for everything, right? They're great for very small tactical pieces, especially when we're doing data input for forms. If we have lengthy type of pieces, they're not always relevant for this. So let's kind of start with a different example where now I want to use something to assist me. So I'm going to come in here, and I've got our mobile app, and I'm going to come in and create a new IT ticket. And so this is an example where we might have a standard form where we just input a bunch of stuff. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and type in or speak into it. So in this case, we'll say, we are having a database issue and need some help. So what that's done is it's taken that text, but it's a large form, right? A leave request might be a handful of fields, but there are other forms that need a lot more information to capture. So we can use voice and text to kind of assist that. So here we're using things like key phrase analysis to say, let's say that hey, it's recognized as a database issue, so we pre-filled out the title for us. We've noticed that the category is database. And in that sense, that the sentiment scoring was quite high. It changed the priority to a high. So again, we can kind of take some of that text analysis and assist us in creating these forms. And this is sometimes as a bridge to more further automation and augmentation for this. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch to my computer, if you can, please. All right, and I'm going to bring up another example here. So here I've got that same ticket request, and again, the same form, be it on mobile device or the desktop. But in this case, I'm going to say, need help with our. All right. So we're just going to type this in. And again, same kind of similar piece where we've kind of created this, but then here we can kind of create some other pieces here to say, right now I kind of did a sentiment analysis and say, okay, this is okay, they're just wanting to help. But in this case, we can say, something like this, because it's not working, right? And so if I add a little bit more color, and we can also say, and everything is down and having issues, right? So we get angry face, right? So the sentiment of this particular ticket is angry. So again, we've automatically changed the priority to high in this particular example. Again, using some of these very basic AI or APIs out there to kind of assist and enhance some of these kind of forms. And just for some of you guys, I added a quick tab here to kind of say that here are some of the key phrases that it picked out. So these are very simple calls that we can make to say, here's a collection of all these key phrases, and then be able to use that and map to my particular form. So what's another example of this? So if I come in here and look at my tasks, we've got a few tasks here, and I'm going to open up one that I've started earlier. And so now we're within a particular process. And one of the things that we have here, we've got this particular workflow, and you guys all know this, but we can kind of show where we're at within this particular process. So here we're kind of submitting a ticket for review. We're going to be able to check on what's going to be needed. But then other pieces of this can be applied to, let's say, the activity feed. So here, as an example, we can say something like, I don't know, we can say, like I have in the before, we'll say, working on it, and so far, so good, right? And if we add this particular comment to the thread, we can see that it's kind of got a green bar that say everything's, okay so far, right? But, if we come in and say something like, know what is going on, need help now, right? So if we're adding different comments to this process, thread, we can kind of detect that and maybe alert it, maybe escalate this, maybe bring other people involved into some of this. So this is kind of more kind of a real-time using these analysis to kind of interact and invoke ad hoc processes on the fly and kind of bring people into this. And so kind of how is, maybe switch to perhaps, how some of this is done. So I'm going to kind of open up our workflow designer here, and I'm just going to browse. And I'm going to go in and open, if I look at my Cognitive Services one, and let's go to, all right, here I've got my ticket review. Right, so I'm going to edit this particular workflow. And so this is where the main process that we're kind of interacting with. Where again, I fill out the form, I submit this process, you kind of know all that already. But what's interesting about this is that we've used forms to kind of do some analysis for us. But what if we want to do this maybe after the fact? Maybe once the ticket is done, if the collective sentiment, not just one individual item, but maybe an aggregate sentiment score across the entire thing, or maybe there are key phrases that management wants to really look out for because maybe there are high priority issues or other criticality that we want to look at. Maybe we need a kind of a review process to invoke that. And so one of the ways is kind of like, how would we build that in? And so this is where we've kind of taken those smart objects that I mentioned earlier. And if I say, maybe I want to bring in the text analytics one, and I'm going to brag over sentiment. And so one of the key things is that we want to make it easy for folks to build this stuff. While some of the basic AI pieces are fairly straightforward, they still require some programming. They still require some tech skills. And so if we're going to let these basic things be accessible to other users, we kind of need to abstract that in a bit higher level. So here, as an example, maybe I want to redirect this, and I'm going to say, I'm just going to drag this line. All right, so maybe I want to come over here. And then on this one, I want to say, okay, I'm going to invoke the sentiment smart object. I'm going to say get sentiment. And it's going to want to have a phrase to score. And so maybe I would come in here, and I've got my business data that I'm working with. And so here I've got the IT issue, and I'm going to drag over maybe the description here. All right, so here I've got the description. I might want to say, let's map that return because we might want to do something with it. So I'm going to say whatever that sentiment score is, I'm going to save it to a local variable here of score. Oops, let me kind of add that in, right? And then once I have that, I can now do something with it, right? So that's where you can kind of call these smart objects and bring those back and be able to work with them in some interesting ways. But you've kind of seen different ways we can work with that API, but how do we abstract this? Like this is just a simple sentiment smart object, but how do we actually work with that? And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up the actual data object that represents that piece. And so if I come in again, and let me quickly open, go to our cognitive services piece, and I've got a few here, but I'm going to open up sentiment. And so this is really the data object, and this is a big differentiator for us, is that when we use smart objects, it's traditionally been for line of business systems that we want to integrate with. We don't want the workflow to actually call directly to those line of business systems. And so here, while the AI pieces and APIs are fairly straightforward, they can get kind of complex. So here's as an example where we just want to say get sentiment. But behind the scenes, and we're using Azure in this example, there's actually 4 different methods you got to call. You need to do a batch job and get the return and pass this other piece. You got to nest and pass this JSON payload. That's not easy, right? That's not easy to use. And so we want to be able to extract all that calls or abstract it in such a way where when somebody's designing the workflow, all they're doing is saying get sentiment. So we don't want to pass JSON. We don't people want to be code. We don't people have to build with functions and those kinds of things. We want to make it super easy for them to build. All right, so what's kind of another example of this? So I'm going to open up another workflow here. And this is kind of and I think the gentleman earlier was talking about how we can build these utility workflows to even further abstract this. And so here's kind of an example where we have a sentiment review workflow where I can pass it in any kind of generic process. And based on some alerting that I have configured, do I want to alert somebody to review this based on some low sentiment score, based on either comments or a description or something like that? Right. So here I'm kind of doing the same thing I was talking about earlier. Is that I'm calling the sentiment, and then I can kind of have a rule. And in this rule, I'm just doing something very simple where we're getting the sentiment score, and based on the trigger that I have set, because it can be dynamic, based on this trigger, I want to be able to either send an alert or ignore it. So a very, very simple rule that we can define to ultimately kind of drive this type of behavior. Right, so here we got, we can pass in something generic and flow it in. And so if I come back to, let's say, my tickets app, we can abstract some of that UI and complexity away even further and say, what if maybe the ticket admin here wants to be able to work with this? So here I've got where what is going to be that alerting threshold? So if we can make it simple to consume these scenes in the process, we also want to allow the administrative to be more dynamic. So here I say, okay, great, for this particular process, I want to be notified if anything related to that process, sentiment scoring is above some kind of threshold. So we can say, okay, maybe the threshold is 50. And that's good to kind of give it context because IT support tickets, those commentary is probably not going to be friendly by default, right? So we want to be able to lower that sentiment score even further, right? So typically with Azure, sentiment scoring is 1 is happy and 0.000x or infinity is not happy. So maybe since most IT tickets might not be so happy, we might want to kind of lower that threshold to maybe a 2 or a 1. So again, you kind of give further context into how you want to do that by per process basis. Right? So I think to kind of wrap up on some of this is that I would say really start applying this. This stuff is really not that hard, and figure out ways to kind of apply this in anyone. I mean, I'd love to say K2 is the best scene on the planet, which I do think we are, but there's a lot of people in the space, right? And we should all take our own approaches to this. We can all do this in some form or fashion, and I would encourage the broader community to kind of take on this. You heard the keynote earlier that this is kind of the future of pieces, and it's up to this kind of group and the processes and solutions you provide to your respected organizations to help drive this innovation forward. And so, but start small and kind of grow this over time. So I kind of stop there. Any questions? Yes.
How many of your customers are using any voice response? Just experiment.
We have some, not a lot, but we do have some. And it's usually more in this type of area, that ticket request example, where they're trying to just augment existing applications and layering in how they can do voice to assist them in those pieces. Yes.
Something you said I didn't quite understand. You had that one of the APIs, you said if you just wanted to get the sentiment, there was actually 4 calls and it was very complicated.
Mm.
Did you do something that made it simpler? Or does the modeler need to know how to use those in the right order?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So what we're doing here is we're using our generic REST adapter because in this case, Azure APIs are all REST-based. And so we're using the REST endpoint with the Swagger definition that we can supply to be able to consume that. And then once we do that, we want to be able to traverse all the different calls that are needed. And this is where the smart object comes into play, where I can say, to work with that API, I need to be able to work with this. Here are all the different methods and instances, and I could come in and edit this and be able to do all the different mappings and inputs and returns.
So you're just exposing all the methods to make it easier
Correct.
to find the right one.
Correct. So these are all the, I need to call this method, get the result, pass it to this other method, get the result. That's how a lot of these APIs work, which is great for technical folks, not great for some of our more power users or less technical folks. And so that's why when I'm in my actual workflow, and here I got a shortcut to it, I can just expose the smart object, which is what I just showed, and say, here's sentiment. And if I want to configure this, now all I need to do is say sentiment and pass it the actual phrase I want to. I don't have to do all that nested calls and complex. I don't need to pass JSON and other these kind of complex pieces to make this work. So it makes this technology a little more accessible.
So you've configured a particular method and a particular payload, and you've given it a shape.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So that's the smart objects thing?
Yeah, that's the smart objects.
This objects comes after it then?
Yeah, and I mean that's a thing that's fairly unique to us. We've got some patents around this as well, where we're not just calling some system and bringing it back, right? It's really a virtual data layer that we can call those line of business systems and multiple line of business systems simultaneously and use that as a single-fied object. We're not copying the data, we're going straight to the source system of records. Yes?
Yeah, I really like the chat example up front where you went through the process. And I'm wondering, you went through one context, you went through starting a process and then filling in all the details, so that's great. How realistic is that in terms of interrupting the context, going through different contexts, and you come back to it and finish it up? I mean, where are you in terms of getting this to work in real life?
Yeah, I think that's the part where we're currently in R&D. So right now we're providing some guidance in terms of how to work with our APIs to use different bot frameworks out there. As we're layering in and learning through that, through customer examples to see what we want to do to provide out of the box. But then that's a balance, right? Because some folks is highly contextual. Us to provide a generic chatbot for a process is easy to do, right? But that's all you do. Get my task, action my task, redirect, make this somebody else's problem. That's the easy stuff, right? But to give process context to that, we found that customers want more control and that they're building it in-house or using some other third-party vendor to build those chatbots that are specialized in that, in which we need to provide that context too. So right now we're providing the guidance when those two worlds want to collide while we're focusing on just the process pieces. Yes?
What's your perspective on the usability of these chatbots? For the average user who has maybe not even an IT background, it's pretty, in my view at least, pretty transparent. So I don't know how, what all I can do in the context of the chat, what the bots are supporting and what they are not supporting. And I kind of like gut feeling that tells me that, that's kind of an entry barrier for people to use this
Yeah, no, I get it, and I think it's a fair question. I'm not here to say that this is exactly how it will be done. Part of it will be. It's not necessarily an if, but how much and what's the reality of these things. And it's interesting. I was having a lunch with a few gentlemen, and we're having the same kind of discussion. And what's interesting to kind of change my own perspective is, we look at these things as a novelty. Hey, it's cool, they're interesting. But when you see a younger generation, I've got 4 kids, right, plus, and when they interact with these devices, it's very natural. And so what feels weird and new to us is not going to feel new and weird and different for a younger generation growing into this. And so it's a matter of how do we, when those two axes kind of converge, is the technology ready, is the business ready, and all the relative tools ready for that? And that's kind of what we're trying to think. And that's why I'm encouraging everybody to kind of experiment with these things to figure out when it makes sense. Because when it doesn't, don't force it, right? Because it's going to be counterintuitive to adoption and driving better process and efficiency. We need to find that right line where it makes sense for a particular app. So it's a fair point. Any other questions? All right, thanks all.